Hey there, welcome back for episode 5 of season 1 on Spice of Life Studio here with Breeder Steve. Today, my plan is to talk to you about growing cannabis aquaponically. As far as I know, I was the first person to do it. I'm not saying nobody ever did it before, they very well may have, but I hadn't seen anybody do it before or heard of anybody doing it before. And yeah, it's been something that people like to ask me about. They often say, you should do something about aquaponics, that they always want to hear more about it. And it's a beautiful thing to do if you like growing with as much nature involved as you can. And you may still be growing it under a light indoors, and that's fine. Wherever you can is the right place. The beauty of doing it aquaponics is really such an attachment to the garden. So you see this with living soil more too. There's more life involved. You know, it's the definition of biological. I was calling the system I designed at one point bioponics. I had the Sweetwater system, and it was really neat. So I think what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the first ones that I built. Like first, second to sort of third style of them I'd built, and they're all fairly close. They were just sort of reiterations or improvements on it. And then also the use of it in field farming outside. That's another one-way trip for the living water, but beautiful, you know. Of course, you can do it in greenhouses as well, or have your runoff return to your ponds, and that's not uncommon either. But to start with, I think most of you guys following are home growers or interested in becoming home growers. And from there, you can always move onwards if you so choose. But the fundamentals were I started to really appreciate growing organically in soil with, components that decompose to provide nutrients to the plants, over growing in inert mediums with salt fertilizers. And I tried every which way I could think of, and I was always experimenting and playing. And I did rock wool and NFT tubes and deep water culture. And at the same time, I'd be mixing up nice organic soil mixes. And usually I found I tend to prefer the buds out of those. But I'd always read, as I was studying growing in general, I was reading about aquaponics, but the reasons that people never tried it in cannabis were that they didn't think it would provide enough nutrients, was only good to grow lettuce and stuff like that. So I thought, well, curiosity, and also you can always hybridize a little the system. So I started the first ones with pots, like small pots, like 4-inch pots or 6-inch pots, which I would put organic soil mix in, and I would put those cut either in the styrofoam that was capping a wet zone, let's say a wet box. It was covered with styrofoam and black and white plastic to keep it dark, and little cuts in them, drop the pots through. And then when you you're planting in a nice organic soil pot, and the roots would just grow like normal. You transplant into a pot. But when they found the bottom hole, the roots would shoot out into this mist chamber down below, and they would eventually crack the pots, and you couldn't pull the pots out because the root mass was so big under the pots. And the plants on top of them were equally gnarly, just really intense and packed in tight, rock hard flowers. And, you could have enough nutrients even in that soil that you got a boost from the fish water. So when the fish water, if you're spraying it into an aeroponic type situation, that's not enough to make aquaponics work. Aquaponics require a zone that I call the mother marsh, and that has to be a medium, a porous medium that dries and gets wet and then has time to dry between it. And that allows the positive aerobic bacteria to colonize there. So in the beginning, once you've got this medium that is a perfect environment for the colonization of the aerobic bacteria, you have the nitrosomonas that break down the ammonia into nitrite, and the nitrobacter that breaks down the nitrite into nitrate. The ammonia is created by the fish waste, it's very toxic to the fish. The nitrate is still very toxic to the fish, and neither of those are readily available to the plant. But as they become nitrate through the activity of the aerobic bacteria, that's the basis of life on the planet, is making nitrate soluble for the plants. So, of course, the water can carry all kinds of other minerals and nutrients as well. The mother marshes were a great place to grow mothers, as the name suggests, and I would keep them under a different light and different cycle. So I've did different variations of these, but my first commercial one was the 1,000 watt with 4 70-liter Rubbermaid totes that were on blocks, and then those were full of volcanic rock. And in the top of the Rubbermaid, there was a hole cut for a 3-gallon mesh pot, and that would be filled up with hydroton or even the same volcanic rocks. Anyways, those 4 buckets, they got the runoff from the tables, and the tables are where the flowering was, and they could be in a separate room. It doesn't matter. For some things, the tables were fed by the aquarium. So the aquarium, what happened was it had a pump in it that pushed the water every 20 minutes, I think, for about 10 seconds on the timer. It would push the water from the aquarium through a filter and into the aero chamber nozzles. You have Mr. nozzles inside this wet box, let's think of it. So inside that, and these I was building in a modular size, and they were pond liners suspended from PVC, and they would make them in 2-foot lengths, and they were typically 4 feet across. So if you needed a 4x12 and a 4x16 or whatever worked, we would cut them to those lengths, and then we recommended 1,000 watt air cooled over each one at the time. This was back in the 90s, late 90s. And the lids were cut out of a hard plastic that was white, and we had it pre-drilled for 6-inch pots. So 6-inch mesh pots would go in there. But what we would do is cut, because the chamber would sort of go from the shallow end at one end, maybe 2 feet deep, down to 2.5, closer to 3 feet deep on the deep end. And the drain there would have a little spike coming out of it to make sure that there was always a little puddle at the bottom, so that the wicks, which we put into all the mesh pots, there would be 2 long absorbent nylon ropes, not the kind that float, the kind that suck up water and would sink. So you need those, because they have to be absorbent, and those wicks go down through the mist chamber to that little puddle at the bottom for redundancy. And when the roots come out of those 6-inch plants, usually they would just have hydroton in the top, but sometimes I would do them with a soil mix in the top. But the roots would run down those mesh pots into those wicks, and they would grow like 4 carrots under each wick. Under a 4-inch pot, you would have as much roots hanging down there as you could fit in a 5-gallon or 7-gallon pot or something. It was an enormous amount of roots for the size of the bud growing above it, because what I was recommending for people growing a bud that stretches, like the sweet skunk, for example, would be root it on 12 hours. People think of it as roughly 12 weeker. Some people would go 11, some people go 14. But if you say, let's call it a 12 weeker on average, if you rooted it on 12 hours, it was that much further ahead when you planted it. And if you didn't let it branch, it would just grow into one straight cola. So that's a very efficient way to grow with no branches and no larvae or anything. So if you did 6 by 6 of these little pots under a 4 by 4, and you have a bud the size of your arm, you're doing a pretty good return on those yield-wise. So heavy rooters, insane when you're growing into the mist. But if you were just growing with mist, you wouldn't have anywhere for the good bacteria to colonize, which is really what breaks down the waste in the water and the filter in the water. So even if that's happening after the aeroponics table, it's still a closed loop system. That water with the nitrate will be back in 20 minutes. So it's beautiful, closed loop recirculating system. And I'd like to build in a number of redundancies. So as the water drained from the tables into the 4 mother marsh buckets, I had a 5th bucket just past them that was on the floor. So it was lower than those 4 mother marsh buckets. And they would drain into that bucket. And the water there would be 2 sump pumps with float switches in that return bucket, both of them hooked up as, joined at a T to supply the return, which took the water back to the aquarium. And I set the 2 float switches at different lengths. So when the first pump eventually dies, the second pump will never have been used. It'll start coming on, and you have that redundancy built in there. And I had that garden run over 3 years, and the second pump never came on. So that was pretty neat. But also when the water returned to the aquarium, I had it return via 1/2 inch or 3/4 PVC pipe that we had making a loop around the top of the aquarium. And it had many holes drilled, like maybe every 2 inches around those pipes that were all pointing down and back into the aquarium. So when the return sump pump came on, it's quite a bit of pressure. It is pushing that water in like really hard streams of water, which just churn and aerate it like crazy. Like adding a air stone at the bottom of an aquarium does nothing in comparison to pulling in oxygen from the surface like that. So that made the water highly oxygenated. And while that return came on, it also had a T coming off so that it could run spaghetti hose drippers on the tops of the plants on the table and the tops of the mother plants. So they were getting a top watering every time the return came on, and then a mist from below every time the aquarium pump came on. So it was really something to see how green stuff stayed, but also there wasn't a super big issue to add a little boost through flowering to get more calcium or potassium or phosphorus, all the other things a flower is made out of, than nitrogen. And I would put Steve's Special Blend, which was the dry mix of my soil mix, of one of the early super soils, I would say. And the dry mix had really a good range of flowering supplements in there, let's say, or nutrient sources. So even though some of them were very slow acting, like green sand or langbonite or something, I would have them in a sock or nylon sock. I would put them in there and it would make like a little log, and I would drop that into the aquarium, and we would see that the algae eaters would go crazy. Certain ones, I had many types of algae eaters in that tank, and some of them ate the orange algae, some of them like the green algae or the feathery or the mossy or different ones. But there was quite a few of them that were just latched onto that log, and they were huffing clouds out of that log of dry mix, So there was flax meal and alfalfa meal and Lord knows what. There were so many things in there. I won't bother listing them all right now, but it would really help give things a push through flower. And you could find that, there's no reason you'd have to sacrifice anything to grow that way. You can get the plants everything they want in any paradigm. It's just a question of being prepared. When you're using salts, they're instantly available. Whereas if you're a bio grower, you got to think ahead a little bit more. And, it's not always an exact science, which it's not paint by numbers, so that's kind of fun. Like there's science, but you don't have to worry about how many micrograms of nitrogen they're getting every hour or whatever. If it's available, they'll find it, and you can really overcomplicate growing sometimes, and that's fine. Each to their own. Lots of people get off on geeking out over the numbers, and absolutely go for it. All the power to you, but it's nice to just see, that you can craft a little ecosystem that churns out clean green. It's really satisfying. And even from, a hobby point of view, for self-funding a hobby, I was able to make cuttings of aquatic plants that were overgrowing the aquarium and sell them back to aquarium stores for $5 a cutting. And it was legal. Pot cuttings were going for $5 a cutting and they weren't legal. So I thought, this is crazy. And they were the easiest things to root because I put them into Oasis, but in trays that didn't have any holes. So it wasn't a question of overwatering. They lived underwater. So you just flood the trays. These were plants that stuck out the top, but they were rooted at the bottom. So you could do the same thing in the trays. So they were the easiest things to root, and they only took 4 or 5 days to root. And aquarium stores were happy to buy them back. It was so funny. So it was amazing to see. And if I'd separated the aquariums more, you could have accommodated some fish breeding. But when you have a whole wide collection of species in one tank, as I did, they tend to eat each other. So they eat the young. So you've got to, separate them into more tanks if you want to actually do some fish breeding, which would be fun too. Like I had a breeding pair of Royal Plecostomus, but they were never able to finish any kids. If they had their own space, I'm sure they would have. But I was really just having a kick out of seeing how many things could go in there. I had little lobsters and little shrimp. I had an eel that lived under the gravel and got bigger for years, and we never saw it until later. It was unbelievable. But the Oscars were some of the first arrivals, and they really stole the show for a lot of people because they get so big, to whatever space they're given, essentially. But the warehouse beside mine at the time was a fish importer and distributor, so I could get sweetheart deals on feeder guppies or feeder goldfish. And if they were out of the feeder guppies, they'd give me the fancy ones. But I would come in with like a bucket of 100 little feeder fish and just dump them right into the tank, or scoop them out with a net and throw them in the tank if I didn't want their water. But they were so funny to watch. They would just get devoured in a minute. There was like 60 seconds and all there would be left is some tails sticking out of the mouth of the Oscars. They would have so many in them that they could hardly close their mouth around them. So that was kind of fun. Boy, one time I famously was entertaining a writer from a pot magazine, and I was saying, I had the aquarium was at a desk where we would roll and puff sometimes. Anyways, I said, oh, it's lunchtime. We've looked at the garden. they started to had their notebook out, wanted to start asking about the aquarium, and I said, "Well, are you hungry? Do you want something to eat?" Yeah, sure. I said, "Do you like Dairy Queen?" They said, "Sure." So, okay, there's one across the street. So I went over there and got a bag of cheeseburgers and came back, and then um, or more likely sent one of my helpers over. But either way, we ended up with a bag of cheeseburgers. And then I said, "Okay, what were you saying?" And they said, "Oh, what do you feed the fish?" And then I had just unwrapped a cheeseburger and I threw it in the tank. And I said, "Oh, they just have whatever we're having," And the look on their face, like, "You just threw a cheeseburger in the reservoir?" I was like, "Set your watch. In 60 seconds, it'll be gone." And it was just thrashing water, and the fish would tear apart this thing. I mean, even the little crayfish get a little bit. It was so funny to see everything ripping apart the cheeseburger, and just the stunned look on their face, like, "I just can't believe you threw a cheeseburger in the reservoir," because the plants look so good and the garden looks so good. There's like digital CO2 injector and monitor and everything. And they're just like, "How do you go from this like Nassau garden and we throw cheeseburgers in the reservoir?" So it was really funny. And I never cease to chuckle when I remember that, because it seems like it was yesterday to me. Anyways, too much fun. So, started with some Rubbermaids at the second house. I had made some. I just had Rubbermaids with hole cut in the bottom and on a table that was sloped towards the front. And I had a Mickey Mouse shower curtain. And then I had little garden sprayers, like for your lawn, just stuck in the bottom of each of those with I think, 600 or 1200 gallon a minute pump sitting in a Rubbermaid that the Mickey Mouse shower curtain ran back into. And again, it was that dual zone where, and I hadn't even wicked these pots. I just had them with organic soil mix in 4-inch and 6-inch pots and just let the roots grow out the bottom into those Rubbermaids. So that was like the most ghetto version I think I'd made of them. But it was so easy and quick and reusable. And you just pull a piece of black and white plastic over the whole thing, slice a little X everywhere the plants drop through, and it's all covered in white, and there's no water spraying around where the plants are or anything. So it worked pretty good. That was early garden. That was just with, I think, one or two 400 watts maybe back then. But the modular tables were really my favorite way to go, because they had such depth, where the roots could be 2.5 feet long with wicks for redundancy into that everlasting puddle at the bottom. It was just insane to see stuff rock up out of there. And the stuff you grew in the mother buckets, of course, would grow as lush as need be, which is great for mothers if you want to be taking lots of cuttings. But it ended up being like the four plants would make more cuttings by a long shot than you would need for supplying the equivalent sized flowering area, or commensurately sized flowering area, because I would maybe have 3 or 4 lights for flowering to 1 in veg. But some people said, "Well, I don't want even 1 in veg. I really just want all flowering." And they would try and set it up, but take out the mother marshes. And even if you just had no plants in them, they would still achieve what they're supposed to, as far as providing that medium for the aerobic bacteria. But if you don't have those, you're not doing aquaponics. You're not doing it right, because that water's not getting cleaned up the way you need it to be effective. So there's, you can modify it at your own risk. There's options and ways to go. But I think a tabletop with the cutouts and the mesh pots with absorbent wicks, and as deep as you can go, like it could be 5-gallon pots, or it could be garbage pails, or it could be big blue drums, whatever space you can manage. The root space is free, basically. You got to think of it like that. You're paying a lot for the lit area, you're not paying so much for the root zone. So I feel like, I know people are like, oh, you can grow something great in a tiny little roots. Like, okay, I know you can, but why restrict yourself to those, Because you're still stunting it. Like, it's like bonsai is tree in a pot, and it's a little tree because the pot constrains it. That's really part of the appeal. That's it. It's more compact. So yes, I can see why you want a compact plant on your tabletops. But on the other hand, let those roots run free and give them all the space they can. Let them be rinsed with living water on the regular. No matter how incredible it is to watch them grow that way, it's really about the full flavor at the end. And we've not scratched the surface of appreciation, I think, that we try to better understand, through studies, some very questionable about the color of ashes. And, there's a lot of ways, and there's definitely as many myths as there are realities, I think. But there's also things that just haven't been explained sufficiently yet. And that could be the same question in cigars or in wine or other things, where the knowledge base is increasing. And with cannabis, as it's more and more able to be studied beyond medicinal uses, because it's one thing to study it for medicinal uses. It's another to study it for the texture of the smoke, for purely, hedonistic purposes. How smooth is it? To me, these are questions that you don't see in the numbers so much, even though it's kind of interesting. In packs of cigarettes, they would usually label the tar or the nicotine percentage, but you never see like tar in pre-rolls, or flour. And I can find some smoke is tarrier than others. And sometimes that's genetic. Like, there's plants that are just more prone to that heavy tar, I think, whereas other ones that have a much lighter character. And usually that is, I think, usually in the narrow leaf plants, where I'm picturing getting some much airier smoke I would out of some squat wide leaf plant sometimes, which might have a greater propensity to be a heavier textured smoke. So I think with aquaponics that it can be just so nice to puff. And even in the late 90s in Vancouver, there was tons of great weed around town at that time, contrary to what our American friends might believe, because they would see the bulk merch that would come down. But in town, of course, there was heady people just like anywhere up and down the West Coast. And there was lots of excellent herb. And even then, when excellent herb was going for $200 an ounce, the aquaponic of the same cuts would go for $300 an ounce. It was just that much nicer. The growers would sell some of theirs to buy some of it. It was just, oh, this is so different to smoke, than what they've been growing in their pro mix with their general hydro or whatever. And then they try some really special grass, and it's like, oh, wow, I want that for myself. Let me know when I can get some of that for myself, So when the growers are buying it for personal, you're on the right track. So I'd love to see that. And, knowing how well it worked on a small scale, let's say horticultural scale, it was no doubt in my mind that I would be doing my next fields that way. And even when I had done fields in the past, like the ones in Switzerland, we had a great field in Switzerland in 2000, and we had a neighbor that had a tractor bring us, he had a water tank actually on it behind his truck, and he would pump water from his own pond and bring it down to fill up our reservoirs. And they had like 1,000 or 2,000 liter reservoirs down on one side of the field. And he would come and fill them up from his own pond because we didn't have any water out there. And there would be tadpoles and all kinds of stuff living in there. So it was real pond water. We never put any salts on that field. We did mix in some organic amendments as we'd planted it, but then we just watered it with that pond water that we had brought in behind his tractor or whatever. And not for very long, but just through a dry spell. Usually we had enough rain to just, do dry farm, but sometimes you go a few weeks with no rain. And it's awfully nice to hit the field with some water for sure. So we would get hoses running out of the reservoirs in the pinch. We had 2,400 plants, so it wasn't forever. If you had 2-3 guys with hoses, they could get the place watered pretty quick. And then later right in the equatorial zones where I was growing, they have, rainy season and a dry season. And there was a natural stream that had been dammed up to actually made like a pond around an island, which was really kind of a neat spot. My partners that had that land, and it was very cool. But in the rainy season, that water ran clear, totally clear. It was just spilling over the dam. There was no holding it because there was so much rain. But in the dry season, which is what they were really holding it for, that water turned green like a shamrock shake. Like it was opaque, dusty green color, like just totally solid algae, And we were watering plants that we had out for our early test plants while we were waiting on a license down there. And these test plants did really well just running off that green water. And we didn't really amend the soil at all. And it'd been like veggie soil. And they may have, dumped compost in it in the past or whatnot because they had animals and plenty of compost. But I don't think we'd done any amending for that run of their old veggie area. And we filled it out with test plants of, different, there was maybe 5 different seeds from Europe that they wanted to try, and then some Punta Rojo and Colombian Golds, which weren't really great examples of them, unfortunately, in that run. But either way, just seeing the health of the plants growing off the water, which we just pumped directly over from that little pond, it was just something to see because you're just literally watering them with green algae tea the whole time, and they just eat it up. And if you're going for GACP with the hopes of having accredited cannabis, one of the things is you have to use potable water. So you have to filter that water before it goes to the plants. And I can see that for surface water, but I think if it's subsurface, subterranean irrigation, I think they shouldn't care if that's unfiltered water because that unfiltered water is so rich for the soil. And there's no chance of, getting E. coli on the plant if the subterranean irrigation is 15 centimeters under the soil. So anyway, it's neither here nor there to this discussion, but it's interesting to note that there are considerations about the use of it on a large scale. But the last one we built at the equator for a reservoir, it was big enough to water ski in when it was full. It was about 1.5 hectares of land converted into a pond. So it was a sizable pond. And then we did another tropical one I did with some other partners in Thailand. And that one was actually a lot deeper, but not as big around. And still, I think, about 6 million liters of water. So you could keep all the greenhouses, warehouse, and a field going through the dry season. Because in the rainy season, that area is all rice paddies. So where we have the warehouse and the greenhouses, that's all on backfilled land. But the open areas are rice paddies. And if you haven't backfilled it, it's a rice paddy. In the rainy season, it will be underwater. So even we had a test license there. Well, a test license. We had a hemp license. So we'd set up and we're running CBD plants as testers while we waited for proper cannabis to be made legal in Thailand, so to be descheduled, as it were. But we had the hemp license before that, so we were already running, testing a field, testing the greenhouses, and getting going. And it was a crying shame because we went to visit towards the end of the season, but before, really probably a month before the rains would normally start in the rainy season there at 17 degrees north. And the field we thought would be done by then, but they had like 2-3 solid days of rain that came about a month early, that they used to set their clock by it, and it came early and it put that field underwater. And it was just hemp anyway, but it really, drowned them. It just everything turned yellow. The whole field was like a little lake. So you have to be a little careful there if you're going to try gambling on planting in rice paddies, because they have no drainage. Whereas somewhere like interior BC, you don't worry about drainage, you worry about water conservation, because the ground just sucks up water and it's gone. Whereas in southern Ontario, which is real corn and bean belt, the value of the land goes up dramatically once there's been tile drainage installed, because then you can grow on it through, if there's a wet spring, it's not keeping you out of the field too long. It drains and you can get out planting. But if you don't have tile drainage, you're at the mercy of the elements. If the field's soaking wet, you can't go in. So tile drainage is very big in southwestern Ontario, being a solid ag zone there. Whereas in the plains of Columbia, even they could use it, but I think they just view it as too expensive for the value of the corn or yucca or whatever they're growing, so they don't bother with it. They just realize their seasons, it's just too wet, so it's non-issue. But if you're trying to do year-round cannabis production there, that would be a good investment potentially, so it would open up more months in the year. But if you can water from the pond, there's so much nutrient coming out of that pond water, or even solids if you're cleaning the bottoms of the pond out. But there's so much nutrient there that can go into the field that if you have a big enough pond with enough life in it, you can really offset any fertilizer expenditures and just have a healthier plants overall. I just find the soil that's more living is more forgiving. Anyways, neither here nor there. I can't say it's the best way to grow, and it's whatever floats your boat is the best way to grow for you. I'm happy for you. I'm not judging that way. I'm just saying, for me, some of the most fun I've had growing cannabis and some of the best cannabis I've grown has been aquaponically. Whether it's indoor, whether it's greenhouse, or whether it's straight in the field, water it with that living water and you'll see you're glad you did. Anyways, I don't know that there's a lot more I need to ramble on about this right now. I'm sure as soon as I call it quits, I'll be like, oh, I should have mentioned this, I should have mentioned that. Who knows? You can ask some questions down below. If there's anything I should have touched on, we can do a part 2 sometime. So either way, I hope you have a great day, and I really appreciate you coming out and checking out the channel. Hope to bring you some really interesting new stuff. Have a good one. Bye.